Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Sanjena Sathian presenting her new book, Gold Diggers. She will be talking with Andrew Ridker, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Sanjena, Andrew, and the team at Penguin Press for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. The exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. Sanjena has requested that you drop your names in the chat to say hello, so if you'd like to do that, you can go ahead and do that now. If you have a specific question, though, that you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting them there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Gold Diggers, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Sanjena's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup in the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Andrew Riedker. His debut novel, The Altruists, was a New York Times Editor's Choice and won the Friends of America Writers Award. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Le Monde, Book Forum, and elsewhere. He is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He will be speaking with our featured author, Sanjena Sathian. A Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow, she is a 2019 graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She has worked as a reporter in Mumbai and San Francisco with nonfiction bylines for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Food and Wine, The Boston Globe, and the San Francisco Chronicle, and more. And her award-winning short fiction has been published in Boulevard, Joyland, Salt Hill, and the Masters Review. Her new book, Gold Diggers, is a dazzling debut that perfectly captures what it is to grow up as a member of a family, of a diaspora, and of the American meritocracy. The book has been praised by celebrated writers such as Celeste Ng, Dan Chown, Karen Joy Fowler, Amy Parker, and tonight's interviewer, Andrew Ridker, who says, from Bombay to the Bay Area, Sanjena Sathian's expansive debut novel upends our ideas of what it takes to make it in America. Smart, funny, and completely engrossing, Gold Diggers is everything a novel should be. Sanjena is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Andrew and with all of you. Please take it away, Sanjena.
Thank you, Katie. I'm super excited to be doing this at Greenlight. I have never had the pleasure of living in Brooklyn, but whenever I am there, my brother and I seem to have this implicit deal where he'll buy me a bunch of really fancy meals, and I take him to Greenlight at the end of my stay and pick out a book, which I think earns me my keep. So thank you. I will start by reading a little from this book that Andrew has seen from its genesis. This is a kind of self-contained passage from the end of chapter 1. The context is the narrator, Neil Narayan, is a 15-year-old boy. And at the start of chapter 1, he attended a high school dance and some drama went down. He had a falling out with his date crush and best friend, Anita, and his older sister, Prachi, who has been very perfect golden child, got in trouble with their parents for potentially drinking. At the end of May, my whole family donned our Indian clothes and headed to a big party celebrating the Butt twins' graduation. I scratched at the blue kurta my mother had made me wear. Talk on the way there focused on the honorees. Jay was Ivy League bound in the fall, while Mina would attend a state school, and not one of the better ones in my parents' eyes. Mina's fate offended my mother. She fooled around all high school, didn't she? My mother said to Prachi. This was the latest tactic in the wake of Prachi's spring fling moral miscarriage. My mother would ask her to recite the fates of those who fooled around, which might, in her view, include anything from neglecting to take AP biology to shooting up hard drugs. She educated us about the wider world by assembling a kind of shoebox diorama of other people's lives, a cardboard drama. She arranged the characters, moved them about, and showed you how they were doing it wrong, turning the diorama into the set for a morality play. Upon arriving at the Putts, I prepared to abscond to the basement. Basements were the safest places to survive an Indian party in the suburbs. In a basement, the itchy clothes could be loosened, the girls' dupattas dropped on the floor and trampled on, the guys' kurtas removed to reveal that all along, someone had been smart enough to wear a t-shirt beneath the fabric and jeans rather than churidars below. In basements, you never encountered garish images of multi-armed gods or family portraits shot in the mall photography studio, sisters draped in langas and brothers' hair stiff with gel. In basements, you found foosball and ping pong tables, big screen televisions, and, depending on the benevolence of the parents, video game consoles. In basements, I learned the secrets of sex, according to information curated from older brothers who were certainly still virgins. In basements, a semblance of our due, American teenagedom. The Narayan family basement was, by the way, unfinished. Lavish schmavish, my mother whispered as I made for the underground. This was her general opinion on the Putts and on any carpeting or televisions below the earth. New graduates kicked back in oversized leather recliners. Mina Putts sat on the lap of George Warner Wilson, who had spent high school as one of the only white people among Asians. He was going to Georgia Tech in the fall, where he might continue dwelling at this demographic crossroads. Nilo, Nelium, Nelias, he said through his sinuses, saluting me. I waved. Your crew's in the exercise room, he pointed. As I opened the door, I heard Mina sigh with a voice less damned per my mother's diorama than insouciant. Can someone bring me something that's not frickin' Indian food? The gym looked unused. Half the walls were mirrors. Folded up against an unmirrored wall was a treadmill draped in plastic. Mounted in one corner, a television, and beneath it, a video game console. A report of gunfire went off on screen. Fuck you, Osama, this is America, yelled Karthik Jain, as Aleem Khan's avatar, a square-jawed white soldier, expired. Anita sat cross-legged on the floor, examining a glossy magazine. She hovered a pencil above the pages, marking off answers in some quiz. Oh, good, Neil. Everyone was wondering where you were, she said in that brisk voice of hers. Her eyes alighted on me for only an instant. Anita was a bit like a wind-up toy, capable of spinning fast for a period, laughing easily, tending to social niceties, only to run out later in private. When it was just the two of us, she'd always been slower, laxer. Amnesia, I thought viciously, ignoring me all spring, and now here she was, bending over the magazine so that I spied the top of her newly grown chest. Now Anita was turning to Aleem, saying, you got mostly B's, so your future wife is Lauren Bennett. Giggles from Manu at the improbability. But really, don't take it too seriously. These things are designed for girls. Anita loved these games and quizzes. Anything that offered a prognostication, anything to help her better articulate her future, no matter how trite. I understood why. A positive result, you'd marry Melanie Cho, could turn you briefly dreamy with a picture of a life to come. The worst result you could land in one of these divinations, Shruti Patel. Who'd you get, Anita? I asked. Jake Gyllenhaal, she smirked. Doesn't count. That's what I said, Isha Aurora put in. No celebrities. Whatever, Anita said. It's not like we know the people we're gonna marry now. Like, what about the whole rest of life? I could meet Jake Gyllenhaal sometime, or whoever. My parents met when they were 16, Juhi said. Yeah, and got an arranged marriage. Anita gave a little shiver of revulsion. One I'd seen before when she spoke about the parents of Hammond Creek, whose lives she roundly disdained. Anyway, it's not like I'm gonna marry an Indian guy. Everything hung dead in the air for a moment. And then Juhi and Isha started to guffaw, looking around at me and Manu and Karthik and Aleem. The video game was forgotten. A soldier spun on screen, displaying his machine gun impotently. I mean, no offense, Anita said to the air. Yeah, well, it's not like I'm going to marry, Manu was saying when in came Shruti Patel. The room stiffened at the sight of her, standing there in her wiry, frizzy manner. Her presence fractured a party. We were too aware of the sounds of her mouth breathing, the way her face contorted when she tried to participate. It required emotional labor to include her, and it was simpler to dispense with all the kindergarten rules of engagement and ignore her. That day, Shruti seemed to know more than ever these facts about herself. Those bushy eyebrows, which so often met in the middle of her forehead as she considered a problem in class, raised almost to her hairline and then flattened. She wanted us to believe she had never given us any thought at all, though behind her, Mrs. Bhatt was saying, "See, Shruti, I told you all your classmates were hiding out down here." Which was when Isha, eyes on Anita, said, "Guess who you're gonna marry, Shroots?" She and Juhi snickered. Manu's eyes met mine as we both considered intervening. But you had to save your ammo for yourself. The derision could land on you anytime, and even among friends, it had the effect of total destruction. It took so much to gather yourself up into some semblance of a person every morning. A rash of mocking could undo all that in an instant. I sat with my back against the wall and laughed as quietly as possible.
Thank you, Sanjena. I love that scene. Well, I'm beyond thrilled to be here talking to you about this book that I have had the immense pleasure of living with from its conception and all the way through to the beautiful printed object that it is now. I'll just reiterate before we start. So Sanjena and I will talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take your questions, or Sanjena will take your questions. Just make sure to put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. That's where I'll be checking. So it happens that just today, actually, Sanjena published a wonderful essay on LitHub about grad school and our friendship, among other things. But for those of you who haven't read it yet, I'll just say, I think Sanjena was probably the first friend I made in grad school. And when I needed a place to live, she and her housemate Janelle very generously took me in. So in addition to taking, I think, every single workshop together in those 2 years, we also shared a house. And that house had an attic, which was Sanjena's office. And she would disappear up there for days at a time, or it felt like days at a time, at least. And sometimes I could hear her stomping around up there all the way from my awful room in the basement. And I worried from time to time that she might be losing her mind up there like a Victorian madwoman or something. But at some point in our second year, she emerged and came downstairs saying she'd finished her novel. And that novel is Gold Diggers, a smart and funny and completely engrossing story that totally upends all the old bromides about the immigrant experience and model minorities and the American dream. So with all of that said, Sanjena, my first question is, how did you do it? What went on up there, and what's this novel's origin story?
Yeah, well, I might cry a little, but thank you for that. Origin story, there's a couple. So I don't know if we've talked about this, but like way before I went to graduate school, I think around 2013, I was trying to write a novel about the Atlanta suburbs where I grew up. And these are like the same ones that recently flipped the state blue. They've really diversified. And I was out of college and starting to realize that this place that I came from might be worthy of writing something about. But all of the early iterations of a novel about the suburbs were just awful. They were like really somber realism, like fake musical, like just really into itself in a way that was like not playful, not enjoyable. Like I wouldn't want to read it, so why would anyone else? And so I had to toss, I think, like 2 different novels that were kind of trying to be set in this world. And I didn't pick it up again until after I attended the Clarion Writers Workshop, which I went to right before Iowa, which is for writers of speculative fiction. And that workshop is set up so that you basically are supposed to write a story a week. And these are stories that might be magic, science fiction, like something that's not realist. And my brain just got into like speculative fiction mode. So every kind of realist idea I had kind of got transmuted into something speculative fiction-y. And that gave me a new way into this world. So the conceit at the heart of Gold Diggers, it's a socially realist novel in that it's about this community of Indian Americans and Asian Americans, first in the suburbs of Atlanta and then later in Silicon Valley. But the conceit that kind of is the way into it is about a mother and a daughter who are gold thieves, and Neil, who you just heard from, kind of gets involved in their capers. But because I was writing speculative fiction, I knew that this caper wasn't going to be like stealing gold for money. It was going to be about doing something magical with it. And having that just sort of like, it let everything tumble and be more playful.
And why, can you talk a little bit about gold? Why gold? That seems like that was there with you from even before anything I ever read of it.
Yeah, definitely. Gold is really important in most cultures, but it's like particularly important in Indian culture, and I think particularly important in American culture, given like the history of the gold rush. But growing up in Atlanta, I remembered hearing about the spate of gold thefts that kind of took place around the suburbs. And when I got older, I realized that those thefts seemed to have happened almost everywhere that there were clusters of Indians. So like suburban New Jersey, suburban Texas, suburban California, like where there were Indians, there was too much gold that people were shoving in like big suitcases in their guest bedrooms and like not securing it all. So it's like really easy to steal. And my mom always said, like, there's someone involved in the community. Like, I don't know who, but someone's involved. And that stuck with me. And like, who would it be who could have sort of a foot in the community and also a foot out? Who would be like kind of a social pariah or have that need? Which is how I came up with the idea of a mom who was sort of single, sort of living apart from her husband, working as a chef in other people's homes, so she would have access to other people's homes, and then her daughter who might have some need for the spoils of the gold as well.
Yeah, and well, let's back up for a second, I guess, and talk about Neil, our narrator, who is in high school in roughly the first half of the book and grad school in the second half. Neil shares a couple, broad strokes biographical details with you, but he's knowing you pretty well and knowing Neil pretty well at this point. It's safe to say he's very much not you in almost every important way. And so I'm curious, especially because the book is written in first person, like how did Neil come about? And it's a very voice-driven book in a lot of ways. So where was that voice? Where did that come from?
Yeah, it's funny. I first wrote from Anita's perspective, his crush, and she's the one whose mom is stealing the gold. So she was like at the heart of the novel and of the plot device in the novel. But whenever I wrote from her perspective, I had the same problem of it was just sort of like self-serious. And the main problem with Anita is that she's a character who is defined by her ambition, which means she really lacks an inner life in high school. And I think on paper, I looked a lot more like Anita in high school than I did like Neil. I was like comically intense. I was no fun. I didn't sleep enough. But that also meant like I wouldn't want to write a novel from the perspective of 16-year-old me because there wasn't like interesting literary stuff happening in my brain most of the time. What you want when you're writing a novel is like the brain of someone who you can wander around in for hundreds of pages and multiple years. And so in the first short story that you read in workshop that got completely decimated, which was written from Anita's perspective, there was this like fringe figure who was this dude she was on a date with. And I was like, maybe it would be more interesting if I had hopped and wrote from his perspective. And so the second iteration of that short story, which was again kind of about stealing gold, ended up being just Neil was there when I started writing. And I just felt a lot freer. Like it's weird that, people keep saying I'm not Neil, but I felt most myself when I was writing from the perspective of a 15-year-old boy. I don't totally know what that says about my maturity, but yeah, he's got a lot of me too.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I remember that story, and I don't think I'd ever put it together though that Neil the narrator of Gold Diggers was the guy on that date, the kind of, you know, background random dude on that date. That's kind of amazing. Well, I want to talk a little bit too about structure and time. The first half of the novel is set during the Bush administration, Nielsen High School. Second half of the novel, it's 2016. And there are these various historical interludes throughout. And I bring this up in part because characters in the novel discuss time as a theme, and they discuss it in a really interesting way. I know one character describes his job as a physicist as, he says he's a philosopher of time. And that's what being a physicist means. So I'm curious about the relationship between structure and time and how you decided to split the book up in this way, kind of bisected in these two time periods. Like how did you think about those two things working in tandem?
That's super interesting. I think the novels I love have scope. They are interested in like more than just a single moment. While I was reading this, like we talked all the time about All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, which is sort of like the structural corollary to this novel, which has like a present day political plot, but then has this really long, possibly too long cutaway to the dissertation that the narrator, Jack Burden, is working on. I mean, we talked a lot about American Pastoral, which is just like, I still don't even know how time operates in that. It's just like these whirlpools sucking in meaning. But I think I like the idea that, you know, if fiction is like a vehicle for the particular to access the universal, that takes place by like linking time periods in a way that you sort of can't do in any other mode. You can't like do a really intense jump cut the same way in film. And I think like 1850s, we've got 1850s California, 1980s Bombay, 2006 Georgia, and 2016 Silicon Valley. And there's something that all of those eras have in common, which is like lust, power, and ambition. And like those are the themes at the heart of the book. And so it kind of made sense to keep exploring those in multiple time periods.
Yeah, that's really interesting and I love, I mean, the connection you're drawing between the gold rush and Silicon Valley, I guess the tech boom. We'll get into research and history stuff in a minute, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to talk to you mentioned earlier, but the Clarion workshop. You went to Clarion, this speculative fiction workshop, and you went to Iowa, and Iowa, you know, very aesthetically diverse place now, not always the case, kind of known for this strain of very sober American realism, where Clarion, from what I gather, is, you know, it's speculative fiction, it's, like you said, magic realism, science fiction, fantasy elements from those. So I guess I'm curious about how you think about genre, especially with regard to this book, and, you know, is magic realism the you know, the tag that you feel comfortable with, or is that not right? Or, you know, yeah, how did those two grad school experiences kind of inform the degree of speculativeness in the book?
Yeah, I'll answer that second thing first. I think like each program is really good at teaching sort of like philosophies about process. So like at Clarion, I made an amazing set of friends that was sort of just like our house. And I think most of them are here tonight. Like in their company and like working with the teachers we worked with there, I learned about how the engine of a non-realist story is often you take one variable in reality, change it, and then it mounts. And you can end up changing tons. You can end up like building an entire other world. But I started to see how much speculative fiction is actually, it's still emotionally realist when it's good. Like it's still about today. Like that's this thing Ursula Le Guin says, that like science fiction is not actually about the future, it's about the present. And I think more than anything, like I got interlocutors. I got like other writers who understood this stuff really well, who had thought about it for ages. And then I came to Iowa and I got another set of writer friends and another set of professors who had sort of a deep and vivid relationship with a different literary canon, where the rules might be sort of like you start with like a character's consciousness and you look for like, you know, the tradition of psychological realism is often like, what's the epiphany that changes the character in this small space? And putting those two together, I feel like it made me feel very powerful. I was like, oh, I can do this playful thing and then I can do the character thing. And when you put them together, there's something really cool that can happen. As for the genre of this book, I had thought of it as very magic realism when I was writing it. And then I learned later that like, I think a lot of it feels more like a socially realist novel in the tradition of like Roth, Zadie Smith, Franzen. And I think, again, that gets to like the difference of like, there's maximalist magical realism, like Rushdie and Marquez, and then there's magic realism that just shifts one variable. And this is that. So it's kind of just this dance between familiar and unfamiliar.
Okay, so we've talked about, or you've mentioned Roth, Zadie Smith, Rushdie, Robert Penn Warren, a lot of, who were anyone else that was in your mind at the time, or what were the books you were reading at the time that were really formative for this particular novel?
Yeah, I mean, so as you know, I wrote my undergrad thesis on Zadie Smith, and something she says is that she writes with many texts strewn across her desk, and I think that's a really nice way to think about writing. It also is like, you, instead of stealing from one person, you just steal from everyone all the time. There were magic realists like Amy Bender, like Kelly Link, who I think write these like perfect, speculative, playful short stories that taught me a lot about how to warp reality in a way that was enjoyable and fun. And I think they taught me that changing reality is a way to tell the truth better. Like you betray the truth to tell the truth. But then there are also all these kind of like social realists often who have like a bit of like caustic wit to them. And in addition to everyone you just mentioned, Hanif Qureshi is the other person who mattered a lot to me. The Buddha of Suburbia, which I only read my first year of grad school, and I was like, why?
Oh, really? Because you recommended that to me, and that like must have been first or second year of grad school also, and blew my mind for sure too. Okay.
I think you read it like a month after I read it.
Oh, okay.
I was just like, literally, I mean, I took it off my parents' shelves. Like I had, like it's a first edition. It's a beautiful book, and I just like didn't know about it because it wasn't like the brown book that everyone talks about when I was growing up.
Yeah. To that point, did you see yourself writing into or against a particular tradition or even expectation? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is I think, tradition and expectation perpetrated by both people like within minority communities and outside minority communities about like what an immigrant or person of color story should be. And I think sometimes people think of it as like, it's got to be this like noble, self-sacrificing immigrant story, or like trauma has to lead. And I don't entirely know where all of this comes from, but I do think some of it comes from this idea that stories by people of color are somehow separate and like designed to educate you. Like it just, I hear all the time someone being like, I love that like I got to learn something when I read this novel. And I was like, go learn that from something else. Like a novel is not there to educate you. A novel is there to let you into the private, intimate life of another person. And you kind of have to get caught up on that person's world if you're going to enter it. And so I think, yeah, I was pushing against the kind of like nobility narrative, mostly because I wanted to have fun, and I'm not particularly noble or somber, so I.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, and it's like, I think that, you know, however high-minded or not that, you know, we may get in this conversation, like that is such an important thing for people to grasp about this book, that it's like extremely fun. And I think people are sometimes suspicious of fun in a literary context because it's like, well, surely it can't be good if it's fun because it's supposed to be like eating my vegetables or something. And like TV, that's fun. Books are like, you know, like you say, I'm supposed to learn something or whatever. So yeah, it's a very fun book to everyone who has not read it yet. Going back to Gold for a second, there's a really funny scene where Neil's English teacher, Miss Rabinowitz, shows her students how to decode fiction. She says like springtime in a story is a symbol for youth. If you see like an old person looking out of a window, that's nostalgia, and that's I think it's something that would be very relatable for anyone who has vivid memories of middle school or high school English. Sometimes that feeling of like a story is to be decoded, and every image is a one-to-one symbol. But I wondered, I just couldn't help but imagine Miss Rabinowitz teaching gold diggers and telling her students, well, gold, that's a symbol for immigrant ambition. And so I guess my question is she right? But also, more importantly, how do you think about symbolism? I assume it's not the Miss Rabinowitz X equals Y way. So do you plant symbolism in a kind of conscious way? Is there some other process by which physical objects, for instance, take on thematic meaning? So yeah.
Yeah. I think that one thing that I didn't realize until I had a lot of white readers of my work was that symbol seems to signify something else to people who don't grow up in like houses suffused with symbols. Like there's a lot of gods in Hinduism, and so there's wealth over there. There's like, I'm looking at my window right now and I have like a dancing Shiva, who's like the god of dance, Nataraja. And like, I don't walk into my study every day and think like, the god of destruction is dancing upon my windowsill. What does that say about art? But I also like, it's kind of there because I'm like, oh, that's a cool metaphor for art. So I think like metaphor and symbolism are just like there in like a lot of spaces that I interacted with normally. And so like, I didn't think of a lot of this as symbolic. I think the other thing is like, gold has always had symbols that directly translated to cultural meaning, right? So like gold has been symbolic, capital S, in every single culture. And the reason is like, it's like unvarnished, it survives a lot. Like you've got gold jewelry, you can like sleep in it, shower in it, get in the ocean in it, like wearing it. It's hard to make from scratch. It's so like cost prohibitive. And so all of these like material facts about gold are what translates to its symbolic meaning. It's the reason it has come to symbolize like immortal life. It's the reason it symbolizes like economic security and means economic security. So I guess none of those things feel symbolic to me because they all feel so vivid and so real. Because I think that like humans carry symbols and those shape our reality. So every symbol thing like matters in the book because it deeply affects someone's like day-to-day reality. And if you were to only have a symbolic reading of this book, I think you'd be missing the high stakes of what any of this gold means to the people who are trying to make it into America.
And I know you did a lot of reading about gold, about the gold rush. There's some amazing epigraphs in the part titles throughout the book from all these like incredible sources. And I was wondering what your research project was like, and also if you could talk a little bit about this character, Isaac Snyder, and his role in the book as relates to this sort of question about the process of research while writing something that's fiction.
Yeah, so I mean, going back to kind of what you asked about earlier about time, like I had this ambition to write a novel that included history. And I remember you being like, just be sure it's like, it has a place. And I was reading about South Asian American history all the way from like the 1700s and people docking in Salem, Massachusetts and trading on like Oriental supplies all the way through 1965. And I would come downstairs from the attic and you'd be like, so how does this relate to your novel? Aren't you gonna have to throw a lot of this away? And the answer was yes. I did a lot of research. I wrote a lot of stuff that did not belong. But the two research sources that ended up mattering were one into alchemical traditions. So I looked at Chinese, Hindu, and European alchemical traditions. And I did that sort of just to like enrich the metaphorical and like magical components of the book. I just wanted to be like, what are all the things gold could do in this? Because again, it's not metaphor, like it's actually magic in the book. So I did all of that research, and that kind of gives way to various properties of the gold that play out in the book. And then the second chunk of research that I did was into the California gold rush. And I had already had the contemporary conceit that my characters were going to be gold thieves when I started looking into gold rush history. And I knew that the gold rush was an international phenomenon. I knew that there were like Chinese laborers who worked in California. I knew about Australians and Chileans, but I had never heard of an Indian person in the gold rush. And so I was like, I wonder if that exists, because that would like make everything nice and easy. I found one story in a German travelogue that was uploaded into the Library of Congress's archives about this man who appears in the text as the Bombayan gold digger, or the Hindu. And this character doesn't have a voice in this record. It's written by a super racist German man. And it's basically like the account of a lynch mob where all of these white people see this brown man and they were like, oh, he stole gold. Let's go after him. We'll hold like an impromptu trial and sort of like vigilante justice. And I felt really haunted by this man's story, both because it surprised me that it existed and because I spent another year and a half sort of being unable to corroborate his existence. And so at first I was like, how am I going to write a novel that involves this piece of history if I don't know if this man existed? And then I was like, it's fiction. I can do what I want. So I then also like gave those set of feelings, the frustration about history to Neil. So in the second half, Neil hears the story of the tale of the Bombayan gold digger. He hears it when he's 15, sitting in a library in part 1. And then he returns to it when he's 26 and he's in a PhD program studying history. And he becomes obsessed with it just as I did. And he tries to find this man in history just as I did. And when he can't find him, he is really heartbroken. And so instead, he kind of starts writing what he thinks. He tries to find this man as someone who might have passed as not an Indian, which is something that happened all the time in South Asian American history. You find brown men from India or Bangladesh or Pakistan passing as Black or Puerto Rican. And Neil thinks he's found proof that this man might have passed for a Jewish merchant named Isaac Snyder. And the relationship Neil then has with this story of this potential Indian man named Isaac Snyder, I just put a lot of my feelings about the lack of like the marginality of Asians in American history. I got to put a lot of that into that story and to think about what it means that in this like major, like in the trajectory of American history, in all of my years studying it, like the only stories of Asians I ever got was like Japanese internment, like not even covering the Chinese Exclusion Act. So yeah, a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, the history comes across so vividly in the text, and yeah, California, there's also these amazing riffs on California in the second part of the book that's just in the present day, as are there great riffs on the Atlanta suburbs in the 2000s. And I'm wondering how place feels extremely important here. This is not the kind of story that could be set just anywhere. And there's so much, you pull so much meaning out of place. And then of course you have this brief prologue set in India that kind of hangs over the whole novel. So I'm wondering too, just the role of place, like what did these places, I know you grew up in Atlanta and had spent time in California. What did these places mean to you, and what led you to choose these of the many places you've traveled to? What was it about these particular places that really sparked your imagination?
Yeah, well, I've lived in each one, so that was like the most immediate. Lived in Atlanta, lived in San Francisco, lived in Bombay. But I remember reading this Didion quote in college in this class I took called Advanced Nonfiction Writing, What I think, at home in America with this wonderful teacher, Ann Fadiman. And she had this quote on her syllabus from Didion that was like, a place belongs to forever to whoever claims it hardest, wrenches it from itself, loves it most deeply. I'm butchering Didion, but that's kind of the thing, is like the idea that you can claim a place by writing it most vividly into existence. And in that sense, like Rushdie claimed Bombay and Midnight's Children, and like Roth forever claimed New Jersey, and all these people we've been talking about. And I was like, when I was thinking about that, I was like, okay, so I have to claim the Atlanta suburbs, like the malls. And there's a conjunction, there's a bunch of highways that meet in this like knot called the Spaghetti Junction in the suburbs of Atlanta. So many highways. And then I decided that it might be cool to try and just own that instead of trying to run away from it. I had been trying to write about places that I thought were more romantic, like Kerala, where my dad's family is from in India, which is like lush and beautiful and musical. But that wasn't my world. So I had to work with what I had. And in that sense, like I had to turn some places that I thought of as no places, like the suburbs of Atlanta, and then in the second half, Silicon Valley and the peninsula, and just like not even like the pretty parts of San Francisco, just like tech campus, tech campus, tech campus. I had to turn those into something worth loving.
Well, I'm curious though about the difference between writing those two places, because I think like claiming the Atlanta suburbs and aestheticizing them and making them, you know, elevating them in the novel in this way is one thing, but then also the Bay Area has been written about, or at least, and certainly Silicon Valley, in like a non-fictional context. And so I'm wondering, did it feel different to have to say, look at your hometown, which you could argue is underrepresented in literature and requires you to sort of do this work of bringing it into the conversation, versus writing about a place that has been written about? I would imagine those are different challenges.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just that when you really know a place, you can always see what's new and what's missing in the cultural imagination. Like, you know, you've written St. Louis and you're writing Brookline, and like these are places that exist in the cultural imagination. But when I enter your work, I'm like, oh, this is a very specific angle on this place. And so it kind of felt the same. Like in part one, I had to think about, okay, people think about Georgia, they think about like McMansions, but like I think about the aunties upstairs in a really big house, and the kids hiding in the basement, as you read. Like that's my image of that specific place. Silicon Valley was fun because people kind of have an image of San Francisco and about the Bay Area, but it's just like it's not like there in literature that much. And I think it's because it's too weird. Like there are values that people take for granted in San Francisco, like that it's a worthwhile thing to infuse yourself with the blood of a younger person in order to potentially live longer. Or just like the rage at attending college at all, and you should all like drop out and start up and try to be billionaires, and we're all gonna marry software one day. Like there are crazy things that I think people don't actually realize are in the day-to-day banter. And then even smaller things like just that everyone is always fundraising all the time. Like that's as weird to me as brown kids hiding out in the basement. So yeah, just like having an eye for that it's fun to develop that.
Yeah, well, you absolutely made these places yours, you know, for the duration of the book. We're in your version of these places, and it's really exciting to see them through your eyes, places I've been and not been. I'll just remind folks now to drop your questions in the Q&A as we transition to that part of the evening. I think just lastly, real quick, I wanted to ask, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the book features a pretty massive heist sequence worthy of Steven Soderbergh, in my humble opinion. And I'm wondering, I remember you writing a section, and I'm wondering what it was like to write a section that, you know, you have to, in writing a heist, you basically have to plan a real burglary and then have it play out in some way that's slightly different from from the plan. So can you talk about the process of planning to commit a massive robbery?
That was the hardest chapter to write, as I think you know. I mean, one thing is, I think that we like mapped it out in the way that like people who are about to commit a robbery might like it is kind of that like montage sequence where you have to have the two conspirators pull it off. Part of it was I had to set it in a context. I knew that there was going to be like a big robbery. And again, I kind of blame you for that because I was like, what's going to happen in the end? And you're like, well, there's going to be a bigger robbery. Can you see how it's inevitably leading to that? And you were right. But the thing that made it function, it was originally set at like this hotel in Silicon Valley that was like very recognizable to people who live in Silicon Valley. It was set at like sort of a version of the Rosewood. A friend of mine read an early version of that and was like, okay, but like it kind of didn't hold together. So I realized like the whole book is about like diasporic spaces. It's about, you know, everything from like threading salons to these cul-de-sac to like parties in Silicon Valley. So this was going to have to be in a diasporic space. And I ended up choosing for various reasons an Indian wedding expo. And the way to write the heist was to go to an Indian wedding expo.
Right.
So I drove to Chicago with another friend of ours, Sarah,
Right.
From Iowa, and we went to an expo and I like walked up these, and like, this is like, it's like a fair of people who are like selling goods and services related to weddings, everything from like mainly the henna stuff to DJ services, to outfits and photography. And I looked at the landscape and was like, I could steal from him. I wouldn't be able to. Yeah,
it's crazy to think of your notes for that time as like if someone had found them. You know, it's like enter through side door, you know, distract security guard. Okay, I want to make sure we have time for folks' questions. So first up from Amitava, he says, Andrew, I have read this novel. Excuse me, I'm totally tripping over this paraphrase. In short, I've read the short story version of this novel, or the seed of the novel in a short story and the novel. He wants to know about the changes from that early incarnation to the book that Gold Diggers wound up being. And I will say, I'll throw in that if you could mention the function of the TV show The Bachelor in that original story, bonus points for that.
Well, so the first story, in addition to being from Anita's perspective, also involved a conceit about, I don't know if I totally remember it, but Anita was, I think, stalking this woman who had been the Bachelorette, and she like wore this gold ring that was magical that she wanted. Anyway, my short stories always have way too much going on. This is an example of that. So I divided it. I do have a story about the Bachelor that may or may not come out at some point. But I basically separated the two conceits. And then we covered the perspective jumping. I think the first half of the novel came out fairly organically, like maybe because it was about 15-year-olds in a place that I hadn't lived in about a decade. So it felt like it was like a thing that had been in me for a long time. It came out largely fully formed in about 2 months. And it like, I had to deepen it and texture it and thicken it, but it hasn't changed that much from its original incarnation. The second half was a lot harder because it was dealing with people who were closer to my age, people who were living in a place that I had lived more recently. And like, I wasn't always like emotionally wise enough to understand what was going on in their lives. Like, I was like, I know Neil's in a funk, but like, what's he in a funk about? What am I in a funk about? Oh, maybe I feel weird that so many of my friends are starting to get married and buy houses. Like, I would have to like do a little bit of emotional investigation in order to prepare. So I think that's how it changed a little bit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I, as you know, can certainly relate to that thing of, you know, writing your childhood that you have some distance on can be, in many cases, at least for me, and I know for you, a lot easier than bringing those characters up to speed in the present and realizing like, oh, yeah, what am I going through now is a much harder question to ask than what did I go through, you know, 15 years ago. Wes wants to know, he says, many of my favorite characters experience a similar, albeit not identical, disillusionment to Neil's, like Jack Burton, Travis from Taxi Driver, Don Draper. But funny is not one of the first adjectives you would use for those characters or those stories. So, and this is the question I wanted to ask too, I think this is really interesting. What made you want to go in this comedic route as opposed to, you mentioned earlier drafts with Anjali were more somber or serious or something. Did the comedy come naturally? Was that a really distinct choice?
Yeah, I mean, there's that super trite quote, but I think about it a lot, that like comedy is tragedy plus time, like that they belong to the same thing. I didn't think of this as like a comic novel. Like I do enjoy comic novels, but I do think like truly comic novels are often so voice driven that like it becomes hard for like a character to change over time because it's just like joke, 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 joke. The comedy that I think is there in Gold Diggers is like just my worldview. And I think it's also like I think it's poisonous for Neil. Like the thing that makes him funny is also what makes him really haunted. Like he is so snarky, he's so sarcastic, he's so judgmental of everyone around him that he becomes really lonely. And so the distance between him and the world that he's commenting upon that can be maybe enjoyable for a reader is also like where all the character work happens. Because you have to, as the writer, you have to be like, what's going on with you? Why do you feel this way? But I would much rather write a character who is smart, snarky, and made lonely that way, like, you know, Esther Greenwood in The Bell Jar, than someone who thinks they're proper or something.
Yeah, and I don't know, we could talk about this forever, but I know you and I have had conversations before too about just the function of humor in literature in general, and this feeling that you don't see a lot of out and out comic novels, so to speak, much anymore. And I actually remember a teacher of ours even saying something to the effect of like, well, you kind of like you watch a TV show, you watch a sitcom for that. That's not really what happens in literature. And I think you and I both, try to think a lot about the role it can play, but also with that wariness of like, I don't want this to be like a stand-up routine that's just like joke, joke, joke. Like it has to, like you say, inform character. And in Neil's case, I think it really does. I think it's reductive to say, you know, like, oh, people who are funny or snarky in that way that Neil is, it's like a defense mechanism, because that seems kind of too simple. And yet I think in this case, there's a grain of truth to that, which, you know, he keeps the world at an arm's length that way. Ted asks, do you see the quote unquote immigrant nobility narrative as part of the marginality you were discussing? Does writing about immigrant vice in comedy feel like a part of inclusion in the American story?
Ted, I feel like you should just answer this question because that was very well put. Yes and yes. I mean, I have one of my shticks is like, if you get to see a group of people, A, as like they see themselves, and B, like behaving badly, like that's core to it. Like otherwise it's PR. And this is another conversation that we have all the time. Like we had a couple of talks at Iowa, I remember hearing people grapple in a way that I completely empathize with this question of like, how can I write about my immigrant group and make them look bad? Or how can I write about my minority group and make them look bad, knowing that other people are going to read this and might judge us that way? And like, the answer is just like, you're human. Of course you're badly behaved. And if you're not going to investigate that, who is? And if you, I think, participate in like needing to make your group look great, like that's a restriction of freedom. That is you standing off your own corners and contributing to like a less textured reality and harming yourself.
And it perpetuates its own positive quote unquote stereotype too, of which is not true, you know. But yeah, it's something that I think it comes up all the time, especially I feel like in this day and age, there's a real sensitivity around, you know, saying the wrong thing, but it's even with your own group, within your own group of like, you know, and who can say what. And I do think it takes some courage to do what you've done and really just say, I want to present my community in this very honest light. But I should say too, it's not a negative light. It's like a pretty neutral light, and the characters sort of speak for themselves, and people act good and people act bad and people make mistakes and people do the right thing and do the wrong thing. And but it does feel like a bolder move now for some reason than it might have been some decades ago. But I always go back to Toni Morrison has a bit on this, Roth has a bit on this, but it's always, yeah, I literature is not public relations for my, for my group. Last question we have here, Carolyn, two more here. Carolyn asks, she says, I'm curious if you could expand on your process of writing The Suburbs. Oh, that's a great question. What literature you drew on, what you wanted to do or depict differently, and writing about that space that might not be considered romantic or, worthy of great art.
Hi, Carolyn. So the Buddha of Suburbia is actually like half set, and like it's divided into two parts. It's like the suburbs and the city. And that was like a breakthrough book for me, because I think I had, I'd read plenty of stuff set in sort of like general suburbia. I mean, like technically like Cheever's stories are set in suburbia. They're all in like Westchester, right? Or like, Jumpalahiri is like in Cambridge. Like they're all like suburban spaces are there in literature, but there's something about like strip mall and like subdivision and swim tennis in the South that is like, that was new. But there's this wonderful passage early in the Buddha of Suburbia where Kareem, the narrator, is talking about how his dad has been in England for years and years, it's been decades since he lived in India, and he still doesn't know his way around. He still gets lost going to the bus. And I think that's a great metaphor for how you have to think about writing the suburbs, like particularly as like an outsider, that this place that is familiar to potentially like American readers is still unfamiliar to people who are like far away from where they grew up. And so it's almost like you have to estrange yourself from it. But I think it's also useful to like Franzen wrote The Suburbs, and the sections about what like in the corrections were, I think, really useful for me. I'll think about whether or not there are any others.
It's interesting too, because I know you and I have talked about translation, not in the literal sense, but in the idea of like, what do you have to explain and who's the presumed reader? And I think that's actually a really interesting point about like, you might think you don't have to explain The Suburbs because they're so present in pop culture or art. But then if you think of it as something that you have to explain just as much as you might, because that would presume a suburban or a reader familiar with The Suburbs. And so in the same way, I know you think a lot about what aspects of your culture and history need to be explained or explicated to a reader, thinking about everything in a novel as like, well, this is everything in my life has to be translated, in one form or another, whether it's a particular culture or something like The Suburbs that, you don't want to presume anyone knows, and then you realize you have some particular angle on. We have, I think, for one more. Aaron wants to know if, from the next room, if Neil's childhood community in the Atlanta suburbs represents a sort of interdependence and interconnectedness, or if there's a sense really that it's every person and family for themselves. I think that is an inherent tension in the book, this idea of competition within a tight-knit community. So yeah, if you could speak to that just briefly.
Yeah, that's a great question, Aaron. Thank you. I mean, the novel is about people who stick together, but not because they like really want to be, but because they are stuck together. Like the first half is about a subculture of people who all are outsiders to like white and Black Atlanta, and they are all in like their Asian enclave, and they might not all really get along, but they're there sort of like by dint of circumstance, maybe because there's like a shared language or like shared cultures and habits. And like I've lived in India, for instance, and seen what it's like if I made all of my life decisions on who to socialize with based on just Americans, like I would land up hanging out with people who I have nothing in common with. And I think a similar thing, like when I had that experience, I was like, oh, that makes sense for like how a lot of first generation immigrants have to feel. So they're stuck together, which also means they compete against one another, and they're not necessarily like, they're not looking out for one another. And the whole premise of the first half is that Anita and her mother are stealing from other members of the community, who are also the same people that Anita's mother is cooking for and earning her money from. So you just kind of can't get away from each other. I think one of the characters even said, I think I gave that line to one of the characters, it's like, it's always been really claustrophobic to be a Desi in America. Yeah, no exit.
Well, that's a great line to end on. Yeah, thank you so much, Sanjena. This has been super fun, and I would encourage everyone. I think we're going to hear from our wonderful Greenlight representative in a minute, but just to say that the links to purchase Gold Diggers are in the chat, so please check that out. If you don't have the book already, I don't know even what you're thinking and what you're doing here. Absolutely go buy it, and buy it in hardcover from a bookstore, preferably Greenlight. But yeah, this has been so great. And thank you all for your questions. They're really, really insightful.
Thanks for doing this, Andrew.
Thanks so much for that fantastic discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of Gold Diggers in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. And as Andrew mentioned, the links are in the chat, so you can find them there. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.